Hi again then guys, and welcome to another Rivals match. And for those who are unfamiliar with Rivals, this is a very simple concept. We take cars which have a natural rivalry between themselves, two or more vehicles, and we pit them head to head to see how they compare, both in a more theoretical sense of how each car feels to drive, and also in a very factual, stat-based way, to see what they can do when they're fully tuned, to see if it's worth buying one, to see what kind of range of racing ability that it has as well. And on this occasion, we have a pretty good showdown. The ultimate track day hypercars that we currently have in the game. I would not actually be surprised if we get more cars like this, maybe the FXX for instance, perhaps a Ferrari FXX-K, and I would say that that possibility is actually significantly more likely now that we have the McLaren, because I did not expect them to add that car, but they did. So that's a very interesting choice on Polyphony's part. And the three cars, of course, in question are the Aston Martin Vulcan, which was in the game from day one, the Pagani Zonda R, which returned a couple of months ago, and in the most recent update, at least at the time of releasing this video, the McLaren, the P1 GTR. So, as I said, we're going to break down each car individually. They're fully tuned, so let's see how they compare. First up then we have the Aston Martin Vulcan. Now my thoughts are pretty clear on this car, and they're already out there. I'm not a fan of it, and it's not just in this game. I happen to think it has the worst brakes in the entire game, and I don't think there's even anything else that comes close to how bad they are. But that aside, I'm just not a fan of the Vulcan, and to me that's surprising, because I usually like these kind of hardcore track cars. The Ascari A10 and Mosler MT900 are both among my favourite cars, but this one just doesn't do it for me. It feels like something that should be the Aston Martin equivalent of a Zonda R, but it just doesn't feel like that. Put simply, it's so heavy compared to them. It actually weighs more in the territory of a Ferrari 599XX. Not that that's a bad car, but for me it's just never been as cool as the FXX or the FXX-K, and it's just not that competitive. Or rather, it is. See, you can't compete against the other two because they're in a totally different category. At the same time though, there's no way this should be an N-Class car, and of course we've discussed that before. This is the most ridiculous N-category vehicle in the game, and before those people go down to the comments and say, but there was actually a road-going version made. Yes, I'm aware of that. Nobody cares, because this was not a road car to begin with. You can convert most things into being a road car. You can make a Porsche 962 Longtail into a street car. There's a guy in Japan who has. So being a street car doesn't make it one. It's just a technicality. This was not intended for the street, so it should not be in the N classes. I mean, as an example, you can tune this down to N700 and take on a Dodge Charger Hellcat. How is that fair? But that's the way it is. Now with the other two, of course, they're in Group X, so it'll be interesting to see how they compare. Now the first way in which they compare is of course the lap time, and it's not looking good for the Aston because it's setting off with a 1:30 lap. Now that's of course for me on this particular track with my particular tuning, so different people could most certainly get different results, but for now that's the benchmark, and of course we'll see how the others compare. I will say that the Vulcan doesn't have bad handling. It's actually surprisingly good when you tune it up correctly. It's more the brakes that just really let it down, and although the weight is a little bit bloated, when you tune it, it's actually lighter than the McLaren, which is kind of ironic. So overall, those are my thoughts on the Vulcan, but what then next about the Zonda? Well, the Zonda I also have mixed feelings on, but nowhere near to the same degree as the Aston Martin, because for those who don't know, I am a huge fan of Aston. The Rapide is one of my dream cars, so it's not that I hate the company or anything like that. I think that's probably why I don't like the Vulcan. It's just underwhelming. This one is a car that, again, as I said, I have those mixed thoughts on, but more so because of the category. Of course it's in Group X. Should it be? In my opinion, no. Either the Aston Martin should be in Group X, or this should be in N, just like the Aston Martin is. Neither of those things have happened, so as far as I'm concerned, it's unfair. However, what is very cool about the car is that it brings Pagani back. And of course, for any fan of Pagani like myself, it was awesome to see them return. And for me personally, extra awesome to see them return at the same time as Maserati, my favourite brand. So that was a very cool update to have those return in. In terms of ability, the Zonda is a very good all-rounder. It's easily the most forgiving of the three, and part of that is due to the fact that you can make it so much lighter. It's almost, what, 300 kilos lighter than the other two, not far off. That's a massive difference when the other two aren't exactly ridiculously heavy anyway. Now the power, as the trade-off, is nowhere near as high. With that being said though, fully tuned, it's got almost 900 horsepower, so to say it's not as high, it's not exactly lacking. And in terms of lap time, well, how does it compare to the Aston? It doesn't. 4 seconds quicker. That's not a comparison at all. It wipes the floor with the Aston Martin, even fully tuned with racing tyres and full downforce. The Zonda just makes it look like a joke. What then about the McLaren? A car which I've sung the praises of since the day it was added. Well, the praises aren't going to stop, because this McLaren is brilliant, and that's coming from someone who, as I've said before, is not a huge McLaren fan, and not particularly a fan of the P1 either. I actually prefer the LaFerrari of those three vehicles, the Porsche, the Ferrari and the McLaren. However, there are some people, especially last time when I reviewed the car, who seem to have trouble understanding what I meant by liking the car but not loving it, or respecting it but not loving it. Well, I don't see what's difficult to understand there. You could have a lot of respect for the Mona Lisa, for instance, but it doesn't necessarily mean you want to hang it on your bedroom wall. You can have a lot of respect for something and the thought put into it, but not actually want to own one. For me, that's the case with this McLaren. It's a brilliant car, but I would never buy one. It's just not that kind of car for me. In the game, however, I bought it because, of course, I review them. It's a cool new car. Let's see how it compares. So how does it compare? Well, it's the most powerful of the three, and you don't even have to do anything to it to make it such. The weight is reasonable. It's lighter to begin with than the Aston, but heavier once the Aston is tuned. And in terms of lap time, well, no surprise to me personally, it was the quickest of the three. And again, by quite a lot. It was about 1.5 seconds quicker than the Zonda, which makes it, of course, about 5.5 to 6 seconds quicker than the Aston. That's a ridiculous difference, considering that all three cars have similar specs, are running the same tyres, of course on the same track, same driver. 6 seconds is a colossal difference between the three cars. So the McLaren is the quickest on paper, the Zonda is the most forgiving, and the Aston Martin is the only one that can be used in street races. So each of them does have a significant advantage. So how do they compare when you actually lay out all of the specs? Well, let's find out. Now, of course, as you lay out the numbers, you can, as always, begin to see the way that a certain car has a huge advantage over the other. First of all, for instance, the price. Both the McLaren and the Aston are well over 3 million credits. The Zonda, in comparison, seems like an absolute steal at 1.8 million. Now, that's more than it was in GT6, but that's half the price of the McLaren, which is an insane comparison when you really think about it. So immediately, of course, that's worthy of getting a point in the Zonda's favour. As far as engine size, well, I will remind those who haven't checked out the series before that this is a top trumps style layout, where biggest is usually best. Of course, it doesn't work that way in real life or in the game, because having a huge engine does not mean you'll always win. However, for the sake of top trumps, we will give the biggest engine the point, and in this case, it's the Aston, the 7 litre. And trust me, at this point the Aston Martin needs as many points as it can get, because that lap time is woefully lacking. As far as usability, well, good for you Aston Martin, because you've got another point, purely because it's the only one of the three that can be used in more than one class. Because of course the Pagani and the McLaren are both Group X, whereas the little old Aston can be used anywhere between N700 and N1000. That's a very good amount of range. A totally ridiculous one to have it there at all, but a good amount of range nonetheless. So that's another point to the Aston. It's looking good so far. As far as power, unfortunately for the Aston, not quite. 2 horsepower less than the McLaren, which is the most powerful of the three. The Zonda, significantly less powerful actually than the other two, almost a full 100 horsepower less. And as far as torque, again, this is where the bigger engine comes into play, because often a large capacity engine will be pretty torquey, and that is true here. The Aston Martin has by far the most torque, almost 100 pound-feet more, in fact around 100 pound-feet more than the McLaren, and about, 60 or 70 pound-feet more than the Pagani. As far as weight, well, speaking of the Pagani, it wins in a landslide, 941 kilos fully tuned. The other two aren't bad. You drop that Aston Martin and it's actually pretty reasonable. In fact, it's lighter than the McLaren, which is impressive once all's said and done. But because of the fact that the power is still so high and the weight is so much lower, the Pagani gets another point for horsepower per tonne. Again, by a good margin. It's pretty close between the McLaren and the Aston. The Zonda's way ahead, more than 100 horsepower per tonne more. So where does that leave us in the standings? Well, in terms of lap time, the Aston did a 1:30, the Zonda did a 1:26, and the McLaren did a 1:24. Pretty big differences between all three. In terms of spec though, well, funnily enough, it's the opposite. As so often happens in this series, the McLaren, the fastest, actually has only 1 point to its name, and that is that it's the most powerful of the three. And then, interestingly, we have a joint win between, even, the Pagani and the Aston. Both get 3 points each, and those points respectively are the price, the weight and the horsepower per tonne for the Pagani, 3 very good advantages to have, and for the Aston Martin, it has the biggest engine, the most torque, and crucially, is the only one that you can use in more than one class because it's an N category vehicle. So ultimately, I would say that they compare very interestingly, but they pretty much fall in the exact same way that I thought they would. The Zonda's great, but the McLaren's simply better. And the Aston Martin, as always, trails behind. The most significant thing about the Aston Martin is that you can use it as a street car. The most significant thing about the Pagani is that it's so lightweight and forgiving, and and also the price, I should say, as well. And the most significant thing about the McLaren is, again, twofold. One, it's never been in the series before, which is very cool, and it's also the fastest of the three. It's not as forgiving as the Pagani, it is more twitchy, but if you put your foot down and really hone it in, it is the quickest of the three. So ultimately, very cool showdown, very interesting result, you could say as well, in terms of how the cars compare. Ultimately, I would say that you don't necessarily need to buy the Aston, just wait to win it. It's one of those vehicles, kind of like the Veneno as well. For the price, it's just wait to win it, basically, instead. But that's it for this Rivals match. Of course, I will see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.